Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most dramatic, highest-stakes military clashes in all of European history. We're traveling back to the summer of 1683, to a moment when the destiny of an entire continent hung by a thread right at the gates of a single crumbling city.
You know, historians are always talking about turning points, but 1683 is a true sliding doors moment. Like, if this single, pivotal event had gone just slightly differently, the entire modern map, the balance of power, and frankly the culture of Europe would be completely unrecognizable today. This was the exact moment the expanding Ottoman Empire met the Holy Roman Empire for an absolute winner-takes-all showdown. Okay, let's dive into this, because the odds here were just completely staggering. On one side, you've got the city of Vienna, garrisoned by a paltry 15,000 soldiers, and surrounding them, an absolute behemoth of an Ottoman army, numbering well over 150,000 men. The city was totally isolated, vastly outnumbered, and facing an opponent at the absolute peak of its logistical and military might.
Section 1, Context and Stakes, the Emperor and the Vizier.
Actually, before a single cannon was even fired, we really need to understand the men pulling the strings here, because the contrast between these two leaders could not be more extreme. On the one hand, we have the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I. He was, honestly, kind of a pious bookworm and a music composer who literally fled his own capital for Passau the moment the Ottomans approached. Then, on the other hand, you have the Ottoman Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. This guy was an incredibly ambitious, power-hungry, and ruthless commander who actually defied his own sultan's modest goals. See, the sultan really just wanted a few frontier fortresses, but Kara Mustafa, he wanted the ultimate prize. He wanted to conquer Vienna itself.
But while the emperor fled, he did leave the city's defense to his garrison commander, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. When Kara Mustafa sent the traditional demand for surrender, Starhemberg spat back, "Let him come, I'll fight to the last drop of blood." It is absolutely impossible to overstate the steadfast grit of this man, who is basically left behind to hold a city that looked completely doomed.
Section 2, The Desperate Siege.
So, what Kara Mustafa planned as a quick conquest turned into this desperate, drawn-out race against time. The main Ottoman army arrived on July 14th, and by the 17th, the siege operations were fully underway. As the weeks dragged on into late August and early September, the city's walls actually began to fail. Now, the Ottomans didn't just fire cannons at the walls. They attacked from underneath. They used this terrifying tactic called sapping. Thousands of experienced Ottoman miners dug these incredibly long trenches toward the city and then tunneled directly under the ancient stone walls. They'd pack those underground caverns with black powder to literally blow the defenses apart from below. It's like a deadly underground puzzle. The Viennese defenders were so desperate, they actually started driving massive tree trunks deep into the ground just to slow the diggers down.
And meanwhile, the conditions inside Vienna, just apocalyptic. The garrison somehow managed to repel 18 major Ottoman assaults, but the cost was horrific. Disease was rampant because of the lack of sanitation. People were starving in the streets, which were just overflowing with sewage, rubble, and the dead. By early September, Starhemberg had barely a third of his original garrison fit for combat, and they were basically out of gunpowder. Vienna was completely out of time.
57,220. We have to talk about this number because it establishes the grim stakes of this war. That is the estimated number of civilians in the surrounding border zones, like the village of Perstoldsdorf, who were kidnapped, enslaved, or massacred by the Ottoman forces during the campaign. Even citizens who surrendered were slaughtered anyway. So for Vienna, surrender was simply not an option.
Section 3. The relief army arrives.
And this brilliantly illustrates how things completely turned around. Just as the city was preparing for brutal hand-to-hand combat in the streets, Emperor Leopold's frantic pleas for help actually yielded a miracle. A heavily fractured Europe managed to unite at the 11th hour. Gathering in the Tulln Valley outside Vienna was a massive multinational relief force of over 70,000 troops. You had Germans from Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia, you had Austrian imperial forces, and a huge contingent of Polish troops all marching to the rescue.
And this army was led by a pretty fascinating cast of characters. The supreme command went to King John III Sobieski of Poland. He was an older, famously overweight, but brilliantly charismatic and experienced commander. Working right alongside him was the incredibly selfless Austrian tactician, Duke Charles of Lorraine.
Oh, and riding along as a young cavalry volunteer, Prince Eugene of Savoy, who's going to go on to become one of history's absolute greatest generals.
Section 4. The Climax. September 12, 1683.
So picture this. The Allied Christian Relief Army crests the Kahlenberg Heights above Vienna. They look down and just see the absolute vastness of the Ottoman encampment spread out before them. The battle sequence that follows is incredibly suspenseful. It kicks off before dawn at 4 a.m. when the Ottomans attack the deploying Holy League troops. All through the morning, Charles of Lorraine and his infantry are engaged in this brutal, grinding combat, slowly crushing the Ottoman flanks. By 4 p.m., the Polish infantry had captured the village of Gersthof, perfectly positioning themselves for the final blow.
But guys, we have to remember how incredibly close Vienna came to falling that very afternoon. While the battle is raging outside, Kara Mustafa orders his sappers to detonate a massive final breach. 10 huge mines were planted under the Lobel-Bastei wall. If they blew, the city falls, no question. But in a frantic, terrifying underground scramble, Viennese defenders managed to locate and disarm the explosives right in the nick of time.
18,000. With the city miraculously holding on, King Sobieski gave the order at 6 p.m. 18,000 horsemen, led by 3,000 heavily armored Polish winged hussars, just poured down the hillsides. To this day, it remains the largest cavalry charge in human history. This colossal wall of horses and armor smashed directly into the Ottoman lines. Exhausted, demoralized, and squeezed from multiple sides, the Ottoman army utterly broke. They fled, completely abandoning their camps and all of their artillery. Summarizing this total rout, King Sobieski famously echoed Julius Caesar, declaring, "Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered.
Section 5. The Ottoman Empire halts.
Okay, so the relief forces miraculously pushed the besiegers out, but the macro-historical consequences were really just getting started. For Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, the defeat was fatal. The Sultan was absolutely furious at the most disastrous failure in Ottoman history, and he ordered his execution. On Christmas Day, 1683, in Belgrade, the Grand Vizier was executed in the traditional Ottoman manner for high-ranking officials, strangulation by a silk rope.
The fallout from this single defeat was monumental. It sparked the Great Turkish War, which lasted all the way until 1699. Because of this decisive loss at Vienna, the Ottomans completely lost their momentum. The European forces eventually pushed them out of Hungary and Transylvania, which cemented the borders and power dynamics of modern Europe. This victory marked the permanent halt of Ottoman expansion into Europe.
Now, before we wrap up, we absolutely have to address the food. I mean, did the Battle of Vienna actually invent Viennese coffee culture and the croissant? You've probably heard the legends, right? The ones about bakers making crescent-shaped pastries to celebrate defeating the crescent flag-waving Turks.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that the reality is maybe a bit less magical, but just as fascinating. The myth says Viennese citizens found sacks of mysterious dark beans in the abandoned Ottoman camp, and boom, the coffee house was invented. In reality, coffee houses already existed in Europe. London actually had them 30 years prior. A merchant named Johannes Diodat opened Vienna's first official coffee house a couple of years later, in 1685. And the croissant? Well, the crescent-shaped kipfel existed way before the siege, though the victory definitely made it a lot more popular, before it eventually migrated to France. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Just look at the sheer scale of the forces involved here. The desperate sapping beneath the walls, the largest cavalry charge in human history. If those 10 mines hadn't been disarmed and the walls of Vienna had fallen in September 1683, how different would the map, the culture, and the history of the world be today? Thank you so much for learning with us today on this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning history.